Welcome to the College Knowledge Podcast, sponsored by the College Planning Network and Paradigm Financial Group. Whether you're searching for that right fit college, applying to college, or figuring out how you're going to afford it all, you're in the right place. You'll hear from deans, admissions counselors, student athletes, and scholars from esteemed universities and colleges around the country. We'll dig deep to uncover their insight and unique experiences. So whether you're a student gearing up for college or a parent with college-bound kids, sit back, relax, and listen. Like you, we have lots of questions. Our guests have the answers, and we're excited to share them with you. Let's get started. Welcome back to another episode of College Knowledge Podcast. Today we're tackling the hot button topic, standardized testing. That's right, SAT, ACT, the dreaded multiple choice bubble sheets that have defined generations of college hopefuls.
That's right. Yep. First, Dave, I think we got to talk about how colleges have gone from this boomerang of tests required to optional to now required or recommended or flexible.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about a little bit about that, dig into some news about how poor the education system and scores are right now in reading and math. And then finally, we got a great guest to talk about the SAT. We'll have Laura Whitmore, the founder of Strategic Test Prep, on the show to help us make sense of all of this chaos.
So let's go back about a decade. We had the big test. You had to sit down. You had to book it well in advance. You had to go to a school and a test center. Sometimes you had to go an hour away. You take this 3-hour test and it would spit out a number, and you'd either be happy or disappointed, and you'd submit that to the schools, and every school required it.
Yep.
And then this trend started to hit, I'm going to say in the 2010-ish range, we started to have this test optional environment where schools were going, hey, we're not even weighting that test. It's not a fair test. It's not a fair test. Some people don't take tests well, whatever. Then you had a sort of a movement that was happening in the late teens that was like, hey, we really are test optional. We don't even, we're not even going to, as a matter of fact, we're not even taking test scores.
We're test blind.
Test blind.
Yeah.
And then 2020 and COVID. And then they couldn't administer the SAT. You couldn't get a group of 50 people or more together. So there was no testing days. There was no test. There was no test. There was no test. And every school was forced into a test optional environment.
Yeah.
And then some of them stayed that way. And what happened was the metrics started to change. The business operation of college started to change. And the schools were forced to take a real hard look at the testing as a reason for the, I want to call it misadmission of certain students.
Yeah.
So they were admitting students that maybe couldn't hack it. Maybe it wasn't the right fit, but they were going, they were dropping out. They were losing their retention rates. And when you start losing retention, you're talking real dollars and cents. And so that real dollars and cents whiplash effect has occurred since 2023. Simultaneously, the SAT has come back. It's online now. It's an electronic version of the test. It's shorter. They're doing a lot of things that are changing it. I think it's easier, but that's the whiplash, right?
Yeah.
And now you have daily schools are putting out reports where they're going back to test required, back to test required. And the real sort of issue at hand is grade inflation without tests causes problems, right?
Yeah.
When teachers give away grades, and then, you have a student with a 4.6 that doesn't score well, that does not compute, right? One thing does not equal the other. It's the only levelized way to compare and contrast all of the students on the same testing basis, regardless of who was giving the A and who was marking the GPA.
Right now, we got Brown, Caltech, Cornell, Dartmouth, Harvard, Stanford, UT Austin, Yale. They were optional. They've now become required again. Miami, UPenn, they were optional. They this year have now gone back to being required. The one thing that is also maybe a little bit different that has now come between in that middle road is this one, I'll say there's a test recommended, but then there's also actually a flexible or optional / flexible. So the recommended, I would say, if you see that a school that you're applying to has a test score recommended, I would say that means submit it. If the school is recommending you do something,
that is a nice way to say we're test optional still. But if you want to get in, you should submit.
An employer says, we recommend you do this to keep your job, you probably would do it.
Yep.
You got to look at it that way is how I would take that. But then this other side of things with test flexible is basically that if your GPA is over a certain point, it's an optional test to send in. But if your GPA is under a certain point, you are required to send it in. So that's something new that I've seen.
Which is sort of a bizarre take on it. I don't know what they're trying to achieve with that. If grade inflation is existing, and it has been proven that it's existing, and you're taking and requiring the lesser grades to submit, but the higher grades that may be inflated or not.
Yeah.
I don't know that you're getting the information you want. But again, it's sort of like this wild experiment that's been going on for 15 years now. It's like they went, we can't get the test scores now, so we're all going test optional. Let's see what happens. And it didn't work out. Right.
Yeah. As we talk about GPA inflation, I think that's a good segue to get into, Dave, today's College Confidential. Some interesting statistics have come back out this past week. So the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the largest national representation of assessment of K through 12 student achievement. We found out that high school students are not doing so great. Scores have fallen to all-time lows at almost every level. Some of the things that stuck out here, 40% of 8th graders performed below the basic achievement level, very down from where we were at 10, 12 years ago. The 45% of 12th graders, seniors in high school, performed below the basic achievement level for math. And the numbers, I believe it's not as bad. I think it's 35% for reading. But obviously the statistics are showing that the average scores are dropping. The top 10% of scores didn't really drop. They're staying high, but it's the next 90% they're all getting further. So apparently this gap is widening versus good students are still very good, but the students that aren't in that category are falling further behind. Again, you just mentioned GPA inflation, but now we're looking at actual test taking. We're saying, wow, this is not great.
Yeah, you've got the pandemic, like the perfect storm of that. Learning loss that happened, people teaching, not being able to teach well or effectively. You've got more screen time. You've got more screens involved in everything. The absenteeism is interesting as well, because basically I'm victim of this attitude, which was like, you guys didn't care enough to have my kids go to school when the pandemic was happening. So why should I care to send them to school? We got something we want to plan and do. We're going to do it. I think it is that perfect storm, right?
Yeah, great perfect storm. Kids still recovering, I think, without a doubt, for that 1 year or two. But I also have to believe a little bit that the inflation of GPAs, I think that's a real problem. And
that's a huge problem.
And that you're essentially saying you don't have to work as hard to get the outcome that you want. So if you're getting an A that's not really an A, if you're getting a B that should be a D, and then all of a sudden you're still thinking, what's good enough? I don't have to work any harder. And then you could take a test and all of a sudden you don't have that knowledge base. I think it's very telling, the other side of this, where it's not just inflated GPAs, but you're essentially saying mediocre work is acceptable. Yeah. It's not outstanding anymore. You get an A, and that's where you start to see these GPAs above 4.0. If that's what you're trying to shoot for, are those also inflated, or is that the only way for a student that is putting in all the work, getting great grades to make themselves stand out versus the next person who, again, if we're not talking about SATs and standardized tests, the only way that they can do it is by pushing themselves.
Yeah. I mean, it's a real problem. There's no question about it. I think there's another whiplash effect that's got to be tied in here, which is that mental health sort of battle that went on, where we're trying to ease the stress and the burden of the student. And I think mental health is a huge concern that has to be addressed. But I also think there's a necessary resilience that has to be taught at the same time. Yeah. And if you don't score well on a test, okay, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
Get back in there, relearn the material, get it on the next one. Sports, you give up a home run as a pitcher. What do? You just stop playing? No, get back out there. You work harder. You don't throw them that belt high fastball next time. Football, you get your clock clean. What do? You get back up and you go to the weight room or you work it out. And I think we have to have that same approach to education, where it's not always easy. There are subject matter. I got the calculus, man. I remember grinding calculus. It didn't make sense to me. Like, it didn't have that mathematical mind to get there. And I was forced into it in high school. And again, in college, I got through it. If you ask me about calculus today, no shot, right? No retention of it. But at the same time, like, I didn't get great grades in that. And it was a difficult subject matter. And I think we have to get back to teaching that resiliency and get through it, right?
Yeah, rather than you make a mistake. And then I think there's a little bit of that. If I complain enough, I can get that test I didn't do well on, or I can do something that is not picking myself up and doing it better next time.
Yep.
I can essentially, I don't want to say complain, but I didn't do the work, and the consequences of that I can still get around in one way or another. I also think that, no, listen, you got to learn to fail in this world. It's the only way to truly succeed.
I remember back to the bell curve like the way that they used to do it. And I didn't have opportunities to increase my grade to get an A when the A wasn't earned. And I think there's some of that where you can do the extra credit work and you can bring it back up. And I understand that to a point, get it above the Mendoza line, if you will. It's a sobering statistic to hear that. It is the tragic fallout of poor decisions around the COVID pandemic.
Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, we're not at the end of it. We're at the beginning of it.
Yeah, and I would say obviously through all this, money's not the answer either, because there's been no shortfall of money to try and so again, more money, 12 billion, I think is what we're basically throwing at it. We're spending billions annually K through 12 programs,
Yep.
and scores are decreasing. So money's not the answer either. But I think this is a good time to bring in our guest, because I think this is a great topic, and to have Laura talk to us about this.
Yeah, I think we'll get her take on that article. So let's bring her in and go. Laura, welcome to the show.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dave. Hi, Joe. Thanks for having
Hi.
me, guys.
Absolutely. So, Laura, we were just citing an article. Some numbers came out last week that math scores, reading scores are at all-time lows for high school seniors. I would love to hear your perspective on it, and what should parents be thinking about or making about this?
That's so interesting because I haven't seen this article yet, so you'll have to share it with me. Just a quick follow-up question. Were they specifically talking about the SAT, the ACT, or just generalizing both?
Generalizing standardized tests. It was pretty interesting because it was like the top 10% of students didn't see a decline.
Okay.
But the rest of the students are falling further behind. And it's basically widening the gap. I think, unfortunately, the number is like 33% of students are proficient in reading right now, high school seniors, and 22% are proficient in math. It's kind of scary. It seems like GPAs are an all-time high, but why are test scores not relatable? Because we also see some SAT scores aren't necessarily high, especially after the pandemic.
I would say that is probably a large contributing factor to this is with the pandemic, when school shut down, when the SAT and the ACTs were canceled. I feel like, unfortunately for students, there was a lack of accountability where students thought, okay, I don't have to take tests anymore. And they didn't really get to work on that skill set. But I want to touch on the grade inflation because you mentioned GPAs are high, and we get a lot of calls from clients. And the common thing that people say when they get on a call with us before working with us is, my son, my daughter, they have a 4.0 GPA, they're brilliant, but they just can't take this test. The thing that parents don't know is it's an epidemic right now in our country. I think it's around 80% of students nationwide have an A average. I don't know if this is because of parental pressure or just like the way that our culture is right now, because everybody gets a participation ribbon, right? But it seems like A grades are being given out like candy, and so everybody has this 4.0 average, and then they assume that, okay, because I have a 4.0, I should also get a good SAT or ACT score. And then the difficulty is with admissions offices, they see all these students applying with these 4.0 GPAs, or sometimes even higher than a 4.0, and they're going, okay, we have this student A here and student B here, and they both have 4.0 averages. How can we compare them? Maybe they have similar extracurriculars or similar essays. What the universities have found is the SAT and ACT score is actually valuable because it is the differentiating factor in those, I guess they call them like there's hard versus soft on your application. So the hard facts of your application are your test scores, your GPA, and you can't get past round one a lot of the times with these schools unless you have those in place. They'll put you in the reject pile before they even look at your essay because you need to have the hard. They're starting to go back to tests required because of that, right? Because they need something else to look to and something that is universal. So it's hard to compare two 4.0s. We don't know exactly how rigorous one school is versus the other as well, but they all took that same test, right? So
correct.
I noticed with a lot of my students learning gaps, right, from COVID. I had a round of students last year, and most of them they were so weak in geometry because geometry was when they were out in COVID. So they were learning remotely. It was kind of hodgepodge. A lot of the times the teacher didn't know really how to use the tech. And unfortunately, there's just residual effects from that, which could be contributing to those lower scores. But I think now more than ever, the score is so important. And that's why we encourage students to work on it because of the GPA inflation and all that. So it's super complicated complicated right now. And I
Yeah.
feel like I just gave you guys a super long-winded answer.
No,
But
it's perfect because I'm going to unpack all of it right
yeah,
now. The crazy part, we've been preaching about this grade inflation, the disparity between a 4.6 GPA and an 1100 test score. Like those things are not equal. So there's a mental health component to all of this that I'll circle back to. But people think that I've got this 4.6 GPA. I should be looking at these top caliber schools and they're getting
right.
rejected because that disparity just says everything it needs to say. If you get a poor score on a SAT or ACT and you have that 4.6, like it's easy to read between those lines. There's no lying
Yeah.
about that. You don't have that core knowledge of things that are required. And we've watched the whiplash effect of test optional.
Yeah.
We did a whole segment 2 years ago, I think it was at this point, in the middle of COVID about the retention rates at schools. And so
Yes.
all these schools are hitting, they're letting people in, they're not staying because it's too rigorous or it doesn't fit them or it's not the right fit. And schools are losing their retention. And we preach about the business end of college. If you need $100 a day and you have 100 people paying $1, all of a sudden you have 90, you've got a problem on your hands when you're only making that $90 to reach that bottom line because they have operational expenses that have to exist. You have to do something about it.
Not only that, but graduation rates contribute to the US World News rankings, especially when they're vying for the top spots like Princeton, Harvard. Columbia dropped significantly recently, and that was like a huge to do. But they are so invested in making sure that the students can succeed in their programs and will graduate because then it helps them shine and then they look
Yep.
better in the rankings. After COVID, when they kept monitoring the data, especially when they started admitting students test optional, where they only had that one data point GPA, we realized, oh, the dropout rates are now on the rise. And I think that that's why a lot of schools ended up going back to test required because the data has showed that the best indicator of college readiness is a GPA coupled with a test
Agreed.
score.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's funny too because we talk about the grade inflation and there's a lot of reasons why the grade inflation exists. And I've talked to multiple principals and teachers, and you have two things that happen simultaneously. Number one, this very sensitive culture about mental health, which is, oh, you're going to get that B and that they're going to be devastated and they're going to have a problem. I can't do that to that person. And then simultaneously, you have parents that are so overly engaged and communicative with the teachers. The teacher's like, just what do I got to do to give them the grade to never hear from that parent again? It's wild. There was a concept of the helicopter parent that existed, and I've now fallen more in love with the term lawnmower parent, which is one that is a helicopter, but it actually cuts down the success rate because they go so far overboard that they limit that, number one, the resilience, number two, the work ethic, and it undermines what we're trying to do from the education standpoint.
I had a wake up call with the whole grade inflation this past year. I don't know if we talked about this or not. I love my kids. My kids are great. They're good students. They work hard, but my son ends up being on honor roll. And I'm saying, I know like you were a pretty strong, solid, like high 80 test score. How did you make honor roll? And then when I look at his scores, like they get essentially the way the scoring system works is you did your homework, you get a 5 out of 5.
Right.
You did this assignment.
Whether you got it right or not.
You did this assignment in class, you get a 4 out of 4. And then on the test, you got an 80. But we add all like the homework assignment has the same weight as a test. And I know when I was growing up, you only got punished if you didn't do your homework. There was you didn't get excess points for doing the basic work. It was if you didn't hand those things in, whatever you got on the test score then went down. Not, I got a low test score, I did my homework, now my scores go up. I was shocked when I saw that. So I'm like, is that what happens? And I was like, oh, wow, 1-on-1, that's just starting to look like that might be why some GPAs are so high. It's not actually the knowledge base. When it's like, well, wait a minute. That's why I think you can see so much disparity because of those tests and just, I did my task. And then you go back to, I was here for work. That's all I have to do. No, you have to go above and beyond there. Like, it starts to leak in like year after year. You start to see these things happening. But that was a big wake up call for me.
That's such a good point because when our educational system undermines the importance of the assessments, right? And then it takes away the accountability from the students thinking, okay, this isn't that important. I don't have to do that well in the test. One thing we always tell our students that come in for help on the SAT or the ACT is the skills that we're going to help you with here, you can take with you to college. You have to take tests in college. I think a lot of students got in the mindset, oh, tests aren't that important anymore. I don't need to take the SAT when it was test optional. It's like, yeah, but you're going to get to college and you're going to have to take tests again. again.
Yeah, and in a major way. And guess what? I'll never forget my first essay I ever wrote for college. She gave me a D and she said it wasn't worthy of a sixth grader, but I felt it was probably the first thing you wrote in college. And I was like, oh, God, wow, right to the heart. There is grade inflation in higher ed as well, which is a whole different subject matter. But your professors in college are there because they want to be educators, and they're going to tell you whether you cut it or not. They're not going to beat around the bush. Laura, let's get into strategic test prep. You help students navigate SAT and ACT. What was the spark? What made you say this is a business I'm going to get into? And how did you get here?
Yeah, good question. I actually started in finance. So I was trained on Wall Street. I was in leverage acquisition. And then the housing bubble burst and the economy crashed in '08. So it wasn't a great industry to be in anymore. I moved to Florida. I had a couple friends down there and I just applied to this job working for an educational consulting company that had test prep.
Okay.
They trained me, taught me the strategies, and I started working with students. It was the first time that I worked somewhere where I didn't feel like it was a job. Like, I'm like, wow, I get to come here and I'm getting paid for this. It was fun. I got to build relationships with the students. We got to joke around. I got to see their progress and how I was impacting them. And from that moment, I knew that I wanted to be in the educational space. And specifically, I liked tutoring because for me, and I've also tried classroom teaching. I taught seventh grade math at a public middle school for a couple of years. I didn't feel like I could get to know my students on that personal level and make that impact when I had a class of 30 kids at one time versus sitting across the table from one student and getting to know how they tick and really learning how I can best teach them and explain something to them and really customizing it to them. So I just fell in love with it. So I moved back up to New York in like 2011. All my family's up here. And I was in marketing and advertising, but I was always doing tutoring on the side. And people just kept calling. Like I was getting great results. And so word of mouth spread. In the beginning, I was a lazy business owner because I didn't really do much work. It just came. It just felt like the path was being laid out for me where
Got
it
it.
just seemed kind of obvious that this is what I was supposed to do. Yeah.
Just to reflect back on probably every interview we've ever done on this show, at some point or another, mentorship comes up. And when you talk about standing in front of 30 students is a lot harder to be a true mentor to them than it is to have influence on one individual. There is a sort of cyclical motion of mentorship in all this as well.
Yeah. Whenever it comes to SAT, ACT, I think that gets overlooked is sometimes the power of the PSAT. Again, my oldest is seventh grade, but I already know that I'm going to want him to take the eighth grade PSAT, the ninth grade PSAT, and be really ready for that. Because I know there's a lot of opportunities and potential merit-based scholarships that if you don't score well on, like that's the gateway as far as the PSAT goes. Am I right? Am I wrong? Am I thinking about it too crazy? What should parents know how that system essentially works? And when should they start prepping for this test? Is it junior year? Is it earlier? What are your thoughts on that?
Joe, I'm on the same page with you because I have a 9-year-old son and I'm planning to start with him in ninth grade. I think that the sooner you start, the better. We do get a lot of phone calls from people who they're rising seniors or they're at the end of their junior year, and then it's very stressful and it's a scramble because it's really a marathon, not a sprint. There's a lot of concepts on the test. There's a lot of skills that we need to build and it takes some time. With the PSAT, I think it's a great opportunity to get in and to see what the test is like and also to get a baseline. But I think it's important for parents to understand that the PSAT's out of 1520, not 1600s. Typically, when we get a PSAT baseline, we'll adjust up 30 or 40 points and we'll say, okay, you got an 1100 on your PSAT, so you would score roughly an 1140 on the SAT, and then we go from there. And I think part of that is because they take out 20% of the math. So 20% of the math is those Algebra 2 concepts that they know that you haven't gotten to yet. A lot of the times is like a junior taking the PSAT. There's a little bit less stuff on the PSAT, but yeah, I think that for national merit though, when they go to follow their junior year, ideally you want to be prepped and ready for that test. So if you are in honors math and you've already done Algebra 2 your sophomore year, I would recommend starting prep sophomore year in the spring because then you're killing two birds with one stone. You're getting ready for the SAT and you're getting ready for the PSAT SAT because to qualify for national merit, if you're gunning for that, it's really difficult to do. To get commended, it depends on where you live. In certain states, it's more competitive than others. So like a lot of the states in the Northeast, to get commended for national merit, like you have to be like almost perfect or perfect on the test. So that's usually the guidance that we provide. We usually in a call ask where they're at as far as what math class they're taking, and that helps us determine the timeline. And if they take the PSAT 10 spring of their 10th grade year, that's a great place for us to start. It's a really nice baseline for us to use to know what to work on. But if you want to start before you take the PSAT, we can always give you a diagnostic, or you can always get a diagnostic from your local test prep company. So it's just important to know like where your weaknesses are so that we can build off of that.
Yeah. And obviously the SAT went through some pretty big changes recently, being all digital. What have you seen? Dave and I have had some conversations on, did they make the test easier? The comprehension side of things seems to be, I'll say, easier. What are you seeing? Do you agree that it's easier?
That's a great question. I think that it's different. I don't know if I would call it easier or harder. I do think, and I'm not trying to sell services, but I do think that if you do test prep, it becomes a much easier test because there's so many ways you could use Desmos to solve the math. And if a student's just prepping on their own, they'll have no idea about how to run a nonlinear regression or how to put a list in to Desmos and then map different things and have Desmos solve it. So I think once you know the nuances and the ins and outs of Desmos, and then also there's certain reading strategies, because the thing with the reading, honestly, when I first started the new test in 2023, personally, I thought the reading was harder. And it looks easier because the passages are short, but they're so dense with information and the time limit is so tight that I was running out and I couldn't figure out how to crack the test. But there's certain reading strategies and the way that they design the passages, there's only certain portions most of the time that you need to read to get the right answer. It's just knowing what to target and what to pinpoint and not reading what we call all the fluff. So at this point for me, since we're 2 years in, now I do think it's an easier test than the paper test because of all the strategies and the tricks and the tools. But I think if you took two students just starting out, knowing nothing about the test, and you gave them the old paper test or the digital SAT, they would say the digital SAT is harder.
Got it.
Yeah.
It seems easier, but I didn't take it. So, I took the old one.
Yeah.
And I took the old one. I get this question all the time in our business, and I have my answers, but since you're the subject matter expert here, SAT versus ACT, when do you think one is better than the other? Is it based on the student? Is it based on the institution? Is it based on the projected major?
It's based on the student. We like to see two baselines and compare them. And if a student is higher than in one than the other by 50 points or more, that's the test we lean into right away. Because why not start with a test where you have a head start?
Yeah.
It's a little complicated right now with ACT because they just rolled out the enhanced, so they have a new iteration. And everybody is up in arms with this new test because they just administered it like a week ago. And the general feedback so far from students and tutors is that the math was extremely difficult. I think a reason for this is because with the enhanced ACT, they shortened the test. So they ended up cutting out a lot of the easy questions at the beginning. And so the proportion of harder questions is higher. So students feel like they're failing because there's less questions they know how to do. So if a student right now is about even or within 20 points on each test, we're recommending to stick with the SAT because whenever a new test rolls out with a new iteration, there's a lot of challenges with it. There's a lot of unknowns. There's a lack of materials. ACT only released 4 enhanced tests in their big red book. The SAT, what I'm seeing finally after 2 years of the digital SAT, it feels like there's more consistency now. It feels like there's more predictable patterns. and we have a lot more materials to go off of. But there's some great third-party platforms and things. So if a student is a lot higher in the ACT, I still think it's worthwhile to go ACT right now. And you can even work out of the old legacy TIRs because they still are testing the same concepts. It's just the time limits aren't the same and there will be easier questions on it. So I think it really just depends on the student. We want to lean into their strengths and their skill set.
When you say that, I remember when we talked about this a couple years ago, it was the same adage that we had talked about, but reversed, because the SAT was new. It was like, we're recommending the ACT right now. Let's see what exactly it does.
Yeah.
When you're comparing scores, if you get a 30 on the ACT, what would be the equivalent on the SAT?
So there are concordance tables and you can Google them. You can Google like SAT to ACT concordance. I'm not sure exactly what a 30 is offhand. It's probably like a mid 1300, high 1300, but it's really easy to look up. So if you're a parent or a student and you want to take a practice test in both on your own, then just Google the concordance table and then you can see how your scores compare and then decide what test you want to do.
Awesome.
I usually tell every family when it comes to should we take it or not. My answer is pretty much always figure out which test you're going to pursue and whether it's a practice test, and then take it. Again, with the optional world that we live in, you might not have to send it in, but you should always take it. It's just a matter of then should you send it to a school or not, depending on that school's policies, what their typical test scores are. Because I tell families, take it with a grain of salt too, because some of these schools with the test optional, you might see like an average score of 1350, but then you look a little bit deeper and it's only 20% of the class actually submitted a score. It's only the kids that are scoring extremely high are the ones that are submitting it. Obviously, there can be a little bit of strategy involved with that if that's the route you go, but is your opinion that everybody take it? Now, I think you made a great point too. Learn how to take the test and study for a test just because you're going to have to do it in college anyway. But from the admission side, what's the recommendation? Is there any downside to if somebody just can't score well on it, that they shouldn't take it or submit? Are there students out there like that?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the student. So it's a similar answer to the last question. There are certain students, and depending on what their college list looks like, and depending on what their background is and how they are as a test taker, I think there are certain students that may not want to go the SAT, ACT route, and that's completely okay. I do agree. I think that the scores are inflated because not everybody is submitting. So my guidance is typically and generally, I think every student should try the test and take it because there's nothing to lose. And if you have a score within the median range of the school you want to apply to, then you should submit it. So give it a shot. And some schools you could send your scores to, and then other schools you can withhold. The thing that is tragic is when students do what's called miswithholding, where they get a score within the median score range, which by the way, you can just Google that. So let's say you're applying to University of Miami, you can Google median score University of Miami, and you can clearly see the data and you'll know. They get a score in the median range and then they think it's not good enough and they don't submit it and they miswithhold. And when it comes back to colleges knowing, like they don't want to take a gamble on a student, they want to make sure their retention rates are high. If they see you have an SAT score and a GPA that demonstrates you can handle the academic rigor at their institution, then they feel like it's less of a risk and you're more willing to get accepted. Now, for the top schools, if you're going for a top school, going back to the US World News rankings, right? The schools have to have an incoming freshman class where at least 50% of the students submitted a score. Because if at least 50% of the students submitted a score, then they'll get points for their average SAT or ACT score, and that can help with their rankings. So what we found in the data with these schools, like the top 25 schools, is even if they say they're test optional, which there are some that still are, students are as much as 2 times as likely to get in if they submit a test score. I think it really just depends on what schools you're applying to, you know, if you're a strong test taker, if you're willing to work on the test, but you can definitely strategize where you can send to some and not to others. And schools don't need to see your scores at all. They don't need to see your scores if you choose not to send them, with a notable exception being Georgetown wants to see all your scores. So if we have a student come through our doors and they say Georgetown's my top choice, then we make sure that they're fully ready to take a test before they get in there. There's no like practice runs.
Georgetown. It's the topic of conversation for us recently.
They're now accepting the Common App,
Oh,
which was a little
okay.
surprising.
Which,
Wow.
when you go to the business end of it, essentially their acceptance rate started to inflate. So they started to be outside of that single digit acceptance rate. And in an effort to change that, my belief is they are making it easier to apply so that they can get their down into that single digit or 7% acceptance rate type school again.
You have to ask, is their test scoring policy also contributing to that? Because if
I'm
they're
sh-
asking to see all the scores, then that's probably scaring some people away from applying too.
And it's funny too, because we talked about the inflation. And what I've noticed with families is they have these ideal fit schools that they're looking at. They go online and they see that the SAT is like really pushed high right now because only the best for 3 or 4 years, only the best students were actually submitting those scores. And
Yeah.
it turns them off and they go, I'm not even in the median anymore.
Yeah.
And they're going, but that's not a real statistic. I tell everybody, like, you're better off to put it out there, in my opinion, because if you have an inflated GPA and you have a so-so score, let's say it's like a 1150, it's a decent score, right? And you're applying to a school that is going to accept that, they're accepting it known. If you apply to a school and you don't deliver that SAT and you get into that school and you can't hack it, that's a tough go.
Yeah.
And they want that sticker on the back of the bumper, or they want that sticker. And it's like, man, that's really not what it's about. It's about the learning environment. It's about finding a place where you have that academic, social, and financial fit.
Take the score, because if you put work into it, you prep for it, that's your score. If you don't get accepted to a school because of it, it's probably a good thing. I mean, I know it sounds harsh, but you're not setting yourself up for failure. I never actually looked at it through that lens. That's a good one, Dave.
It's dating. You go on a dating app and you lie in your profile.
Exactly right.
People are going to realize, hey, we're not a good fit. Just be your authentic self from the beginning. That makes so much sense. Yeah, good call.
A year of college costs a little bit more than night out, though.
Yeah, for sure it does.
That's true.
Do you have any sort of like standard advice you give families, people, any recommendations you make around the testing specifically?
Yeah, I think that practice is really important, and there's a lot of great free resources out there. So I would start with that. Blue Book Exams is the app you can download, and there's 7 practice tests in there released by College Board. And I would recommend starting with official materials because there's a lot of third-party materials out there like Princeton Review, Barron's. I've read those questions, I've tried those questions, and there's just something about them that just doesn't always feel quite right. There's something off, or they change. It's like, having a real Louis Vuitton versus a fake.
Yeah.
If you're an expert, you can tell. I would say start with getting the app because College Board actually released data this past year. They've been tracking the student data since they started with the digital SAT in 2023, and they found that students on average go up as much as 80 points on the test if they take 3 practice tests before the real test. 1 practice test, they go up about 20 points on average. If they take 2 practice tests, they go up about 46 points on average. 3 is 80. Also, too, there's the College Board question bank. So you can Google College Board question bank. And what's really nice is after you take a Blue Book practice test, they'll show you your results instantaneously, and they'll give you a generalized breakdown of what categories you're weaker in and where you're missing points. And then you can use the College Board question bank as a tool to actually filter to those specific types of questions and practice those. And you can work in your zone of proximal development because you can choose what difficulty level you want to work on. So if you're, let's say, a 550 or 600 score on the English, you might want to start with the mediums. And then once you master the mediums, then you can layer in the hards. Also, Khan Academy has a program. They partner with College Board, and I know that they have like an asynchronous SAT course. So a lot of the students that I know of start with that, and they really enjoy it. There's just a lot of resources out there, and the sooner you can get started and get familiar with the test, the better, and then just go from there. But yeah, the more practice you do, typically the better results you're going to see. Now, where like a test prep coach comes in is if you're prepping on your own and then you take a test and you get a certain score, but you kind of know that if you continue on your own, you're plateauing and you might not be able to move any further. It's like anything. We all need coaches in order to get to the
100%.
next level. Then, you can always look into possibly working with a test prep coach that can show you different approaches to the questions and different ways of looking at the questions, and also showing you the trends and what they think might be showing up on the test. That's kind of where we come into play and help students. But yeah, I would just say start by trying a test and seeing what it's like.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there, right? First, there's get comfortable with it. Understand what you get into. Take away the mystique of this. You got to go into this testing room, or you got to get on the computer and have monitors and proctors and whatever. But also, just like with anything in life, if you don't practice it, you're not going to be good at it. You don't sit down and just become a pianist, right? And I think there was a study done of Asian American students coming. So in the 80s, there was a big boom in the chemical industry in which they were seeking Japanese and Chinese engineers, petroleum and otherwise, to come over to this country. And the Asian culture was to really prepare for the tests. This was when, back in the day, when they thought you couldn't prepare for the SAT, or there wasn't like a huge, you couldn't study for it. And they proved that wrong by virtue of all of the perfect scores that came in over that period of time. And so I think the bottom line is practice, prep for it, right? It's a test just like any other. Would you go into your history exam without having read the material? No.
Well, if the teacher's going to give you an A anyway.
Fair enough. Any final thoughts you want to share before we end this? Laura, this has been awesome.
Yeah, I just want to say, and this might sound cliche, your SAT or ACT score doesn't define you. So if you take official tests and you're not landing the goal that you want, please just know that this is just one test. And also, what I see from students is the students that end up being the most successful on the test are merely the students that just persevere in the face of adversity and keep going. Most students are not a one-hit wonder where they take one test and they hit their goal and they're done. It's a process. And it really kind of is an opportunity to shape your character and mold yourself into the person you want to be, because it really just comes down to grit and determination and keeping at it. So every test you do, you can learn from it and then make adjustments. But I would just say, don't leave before the miracle happens, and give yourself a shot to really succeed on the test. So give yourself some time and be patient.
Awesome.
Love it. Laura, where can our listeners find you, by the way?
So we have actually a free YouTube channel. It's called Strategic Test Prep. So I have a lot of videos and resources to teach you how to take the test. So check us out on YouTube. And if you want, you can also go to our website, strategictestprep.com.
Awesome stuff.
Thanks, guys.
All
Thanks
right.
so much.
Take care.